Something's still eating at you. What is it?
No defensive wounds. Shanann didn't struggle. Him. The entire time, she thought he was going to let go. Right up till the very end.
Hello and welcome to part 2 of 31 Things Wrong with the Chris Watts Lifetime movie. If you'd like to skip the audio, you're welcome to head on to the original post, which has been updated, so you can see all the other links going from number 17 to the end. I want to also just apologize, if my voice is a little bit weak or not clear. I did some intervals earlier this afternoon. It was a very, very hot day, and it was very dry, and I don't know, it's just very hot air going down into the lungs, and my throat's hasn't quite recovered from that. So if my voice is irritating you, or if you've heard one too many, you're welcome to just head on over to the blog post, and all the information is there for you. And that really applies to all the videos that I make. Many of them are based on blog posts that are up on crimerocket.com. So if you want the shorter version, just head on there, and it might be a quicker read than for you to listen to it here. For the rest who prefer to hear the audio version of some of the coverage with a little bit of color and insight thrown in, then please do subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to get to about 10,000 subscribers. I'm relying on you to share also on your social media networks, especially Facebook and Twitter. So if you're finding value in this, it's quite important that you also let others know, especially in other true crime communities. So I would appreciate that. In terms of the Patreon channel of True Crime Rocket Science, there is also deeper and darker analysis of the Lifetime movie. That's under the $5 tier, and there's also quite a lot of other content up there, for example audiobooks, and also analysis of the John Benet Ramsey case and so on, but we'll get to that at the end of this episode. So let's get started with the remaining aspects that I found just kind of in a gloss through that stood out as being wrong, or being errors, or not being completely accurate. And one of the things I just want to reference before we go on to number 17 is just something from the discovery, which shows the sort of exact time and circumstances when Chris Watts Googled when to say I love you. And it wasn't just one Google search, it was actually around about 4. So it was 4 separate searches separated by around about 3 hours. And this is all on July 25th. And of course he went camping with Kessinger a couple of days after that. And then he also wrote a love letter 5 days after that. So he certainly had love on his mind. I've heard a lot of people say that he just felt lust. I don't think a guy feeling lust would do something like this. I don't think he would Google I love you. He would just say it. If he was a manipulator, I don't think he would Google. I don't think he would make cards. I don't think he would be thinking about moving out or anything like that if it was just lust. One thing worth commenting on, just in terms of this activity from Watts on the 25th is on either side. On either side of it, we see calls from Shanann, long calls. One early in the morning, 5:36, where they talk for 11 minutes, and then another one late in the afternoon, 16:35. Basically, when he left for work and when he arrived back home from work, and then she had a 23-minute conversation. And that's really kind of a aspect that is completely missing from this whole case. We don't know what they spoke about in those conversations, not just on that particular day, but in all those conversations that they had. And that's something we kind of have to rely on Chris Watts to tell us, because Shanann isn't here to tell us. And he probably wouldn't tell us, but it does make one wonder, what could they have spoken about? Could they have spoken about their finances? Could they have spoken about the house? Could they have spoken about Shanann's income with Thrive? What would they have been talking about? What was going on in their lives? Could they have been talking about the mortgage payments? Could they have been talking about the homeowners association that wanted to take them to court? What sort of things were they talking about that they weren't SMSing? Okay, and so that brings us to point number 17, where we see it dramatized how Watts sort of heads to North Carolina, and he's just suddenly there. He sort of seems to take a taxi from the airport, and he sort of seems to arrive, at some kind of location, I guess, in Aberdeen. But that is not what happened. And that reminds me, if we go to the image posted on social media, which, by the way, doesn't exist anymore, we see Chris Watts with Shanann and the kids, and they are at the airport. And this is obviously, Chris Watts didn't go with his family, but he went with them to the airport. And you can see there are quite a few bags there, and basically he drove them there and sort of dropped them off, and then he drove home. There was no question of the car being parked at the airport or anything like that, or Shanann taking a taxi to the airport. He took her there and then dropped her off. So that scene that I've described as, I think one of the most powerful in the Lifetime movie, just in the symbolic sense, where you see Watts looking at his home, and the home sort of, as from the perspective of zooming in from behind, the home seems to sort of advance towards Chris Watts and kind of engulf him. All of that happens in the dramatization where he's just said goodbye to Shanann kind of in the road. And that's just not what happened. But in a dramatic sense, it's maybe a more powerful moment and a more powerful statement than if you had Watts sort of going to the airport and then kind of driving back. But there's also a economic issue in driving someone to the airport, so that they don't need to leave their car there or whatever it is. And they don't need to take a taxi, right? And this sort of raises the question, how important is it to kind of get the details right? And for True Crime Rocket Science, that's not actually a valid question. It's vital to get all the issues right, all the questions right, all the dynamics right, to get everything right. It's absolutely vital. And we're just going to go through a little thought experiment now, just looking at what happens when you deviate, what happens when you leave out details. So kind of in a simple little situation, like just sort of jumping from the sand dunes to Watts arriving by taxi, what has been left out? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot. So something that I haven't put on the blog post, but is nevertheless in the discovery, is during the flight to North Carolina, Watts transferred a heck of a lot of images to his secret calculator app during the flight. So just a lot of images, hundreds of images were transferred during the flight. So that was what he was thinking of. So while he was flying to North Carolina, he was already in the sort of subterfuge mode. He was already in a cover-up sort of mode. He was already in a sort of hiding things away mode. And you might say, well, Chris Watts is a crafty fox, and he was, but there's a little bit more to it than that. Watts also got into a big trouble for driving himself to the airport and parking the car somewhere. And Shanann, just as Shanann would later ask about the restaurant receipt, she also wanted to know where he'd parked the car, and she wanted sort of photos of where he'd parked. Excuse me. And Shanann was furious that he was spending so much money unnecessarily on a particular kind of parking. And I think she said somewhere in the discovery that's $130 less that we have to use at Myrtle Beach. So in this kind of scenario of him driving to the airport, and I think he knew that he wasn't supposed to, but I think he was already just inwardly thinking, well, screw Shanann, I'm going to do what I want. But nevertheless, a little bit frightened of how she was going to respond. So Shanann did get a little bit offended. And so with that kind of shadow in mind, with that kind of scenario in mind of Shanann being upset about the parking, Watts then shifts all these images to his secret calculator app. And what's happening there is sort of showing that he's making absolutely sure that she's not going to be able to find anything on his phone, because he knows if she does, he's going to be in huge trouble. So he's taking very, very careful precautions to make sure that his phone is kind of clean, if that makes sense. He's cleaning his phone so that if somebody looks at it at face value, it's going to pass that sort of test of scrutiny. And we know that Shanann did use his phone. She sometimes used his phone to post on his Facebook. She kind of had control of his Facebook as well. So that was quite likely to happen. Now, again, if we're talking about accuracy, one can say, well, why do you really want to dramatize Chris Watts going from Colorado to North Carolina? Like, why would you want to show that? Why not just do it the way Lifetime did, just show him arriving? So if I was making this movie, what I would do is I would show pertinently and specifically this particular moment, because it's so crucial. So I would show Chris Watts with Nicole Kessinger. I would also try and show him, getting into a pattern of going to her home every night, sleeping over every night, getting into the lifestyle with her every night, after week after week after week, just try and show sort of a pattern of events blurring into one another. And then suddenly he's got to leave that. He's got to leave this sort of honeymoon that he's been in. And then it goes from that honeymoon to, the moment he arrives at the airport, he kind of snaps out of the honeymoon. Now he's got to be accountable to the actual woman in his life, the actual woman he's married to, the actual woman he's formally, legally tied to. And there's immediately a different vibe to that. It's more kind of spiky and less less fun, less lighthearted. It's just kind of a drag for him, and that's something I would want to just illustrate. Is this, and it's a thing that is just typical in marriages. You have to pay bills, you've got to pay for school fees, and it's just not a very romantic side to it. And if you compare that to when you're not married, the aspects that are quite romantic. So it's not to cast any aspersions on any individuals. It's just to say this was the contrast that he felt. It's suddenly being back into being obligated, and you need to do this, and why didn't you do that, and all that kind of thing. And that's not sort of fictionalizing, that's in the discovery. So you can go to Crime Rocket, that refers to this meeting at the airport. It's also referred to in the discovery, in the phone data review. You can go and look at that. I'm not really going to go into it in much detail here, but it just describes a little bit of detail around that quite dramatic meeting of Chris Watts seeing his children and seeing his wife for the first time, and there was drama around that. He didn't kiss his wife, or he had to be asked to kiss Shanann at the airport, and this is something she brought up quite a few days later, that I'm having to ask you to be affectionate towards me. So that was quite a singular moment. And unfortunately, the video that originally depicted Watts arriving has been removed. And, these days when I go through blog posts that I put up, every day for months, invariably it's the content's been removed, the content's been removed, the content's been removed. And so you sort of got to ask yourself who wins by taking that content away. Like, who wins, and how do these people gain, by doing that? In any event, when you look at those videos, they're not there and you can't see them. But I can tell you that Watts does look a bit he has sort of a cheesy smile when he looks up at Shanann, and he should have a cheesy smile because he's been cheating on her, and he can't be honest, and he doesn't want to be honest, and goes even further than that. It does look like he tried to poison her on his very first day in North Carolina. Of course, that's not depicted either. And you could give Lifetime kind of a reprieve and say, well, they made this film before the third confession came out. This kind of stuff was in the script before the third confession came out. But nevertheless, the very first night, we know from the discovery that Shanann was sick and they slept in separate rooms. That's not dramatized, and that's something the Ruseks could have been consulted on. I don't know whether the Ruseks would say, Shanann was very upset, she was sick. I don't know whether they would. I don't know what they would say about that. So I'm not going to take that any further, except to refer to another blog post that's, I think, on Crime Rocket 2, that just refers to the same kind of moment, and also that video footage has also been removed there. What the video footage shows is Chris Watts sort of running up to his children, and just the kind of interaction, now one's got to sort of describe that interaction, describe the memory of it, where previously people could see it for themselves. And it's not so much the interaction with the children that matters. It's actually the way Chris Watts doesn't really interact with his wife at the airport in that moment. He sort of doesn't want to confront her in that moment. Because where's he just been? He's just been to the sand dunes. And where's his mind? And where's his heart? And he probably doesn't want the look in his eyes and the look on his face to give him away. And then another detail, Watts gave Kessinger this card on their last day together in Colorado. So bear in mind, on his very last day, he actually slept in. He probably slept at Kessinger's home, and gave her this card on that last day. So that gives it kind of this extra significance. This was sort of like Watts obviously didn't want to leave her, but he'd committed to what he was doing, and I guess he felt he didn't have an excuse not to go. But can you imagine if Watts didn't return to North Carolina? That would have sent a message in itself, and in a way, the outcome may have been different. Shanann may have realized, okay, things are bad. I don't want to actually return home. I'm going to return home when you've changed or when you've made up your mind or something like that. And you never know, you could have had a different outcome. One thing Lifetime did get right was the color of Watts' shirt, although they don't have the fact that he was wearing short, dark trousers. They don't have that right. They do depict Watts kind of early on in North Carolina, just appearing on his own, brooding, standoffish. That part is at least true. And then there's some dramatization of text, which I don't fault Lifetime for doing. So where she says certain things to Chris Watts, that's based on the discovery, and one of these things is a scenario on kind of a pier. I guess that's supposed to be at Myrtle Beach, where she tells him she's spotting. And this is kind of the first time that you kind of get a sense of the couple not getting along when they're together. Whereas prior to this, before they went to North Carolina, or Shanann certainly got along with Chris Watts. Whether he got along with her so much, I'm not going to go into that here, but it's certainly different from Shanann's perspective. She's starting to feel sensitive and overlooked, and wondering what's going on. She's noticing something is happening, and that moment where she talks about spotting is August the 5th. And one thing I've noticed in this Lifetime movies, there are not really any dates or times. It's just not mentioned. And I've seen some Lifetime movies that do show a lot of times and dates. So they've just elected to keep the whole thing kind of a maelstrom of fuzziness, I guess. In the same way that by depicting the airport scene, not depicting the airport scene and missing all of that subtlety, there's also a video of the Watts family at Myrtle Beach, and you can kind of feel the tension. There's not like spontaneousness between the adults. It's just supposed to be this happy moment, and it's just kind of tense, and there's something unsaid about it, and that's just not depicted. Instead, you see something else. You see the children kind of flying a kite, and Shanann just sort of looking over, and she seems sort of kind of concerned. So of course that video has also been removed, and then you sort of jump to number 20, which is they kind of have a argument or a disagreement in Colorado, and Watts decides they should take a trip to Aspen to mend their relationship. Now this is true. This is based on fact. They did plan on taking a romantic trip to fix their relationship, but I don't think it was Chris Watts' idea. I don't think he kind of said, okay, why don't we do this, and then we can talk about everything. I really don't think that happened. I think Shanann, well, we know Shanann was pushing for couples counseling, and so it's also likely that she would have maybe read something and then just said, why don't we go away for the weekend? And all Watts had to do was consent to that, and he could kind of diffuse things from getting any worse, and so more than likely that's what he did. And And so I don't think the depiction in Lifetime in that respect is accurate either. Then we go to number 21, just a small little gripe, but it's kind of significant. You see characters depicting Nicole and Nicholas Atkinson, but behind them you kind of see the garage and there are no windows in it. So how did they know that Shanann wasn't home? How did they know that her car wasn't there or was there? And of course, in reality, there are little windows in the garage, small little square windows sort of set into the garage doors. And what happened was when Nicole got there, she didn't just sort of arrive, look around, shout through the door and leave. She actually went through quite a lot of trouble. And one of the final steps was sort of pulling her car closer to the garage door than it was, and then having her son stand on the edge of the car and then look in through the windows. And when he looked in, he saw her car was there. And that was a very big, I think, game changer, because the fact that her car was there meant, why the heck would she not be there? Like, she wouldn't go anywhere without her car. I think this was a big miscalculation from Chris Watts. I think he, well, I don't know how he would have any idea that Nicole would be this sort of conscientious about checking on her friend, but certainly Shanann kind of gave Nicole quite a few reasons to be concerned about it. It wasn't just her health. She was just not in a good way while they were in Arizona. And so it's just, you wouldn't have expected Watts to have expected this, right? You wouldn't have expected there's no way Watts would have expected Nicole to have sort of driven her car to the garage door and gotten on and looked herself. And so he had no way of knowing that she would have brought her son along. And that kind of changed quite a few things, because her son also found the phone in the couch. That's not dramatized in the Lifetime movie, but it certainly is kind of implied. When Watts finds the phone, the Nicholas character sort of says something. I think he says where it was. Then number 22, the depiction of Watts sort of arriving home with Coonrod there and approaching Coonrod and going into the garage. That's quite well depicted, although you've also got to ask, why the heck wouldn't filmmakers get this right? All you've got to do is copy what's right in front of you. You know, how hard is it just to copy footage, right? So, not that it's a big deal, but Nicholas wasn't standing there when Watts arrived. What they do get right is Watts didn't just come out, he sort of comes round and then he sort of looks into the car, maybe getting the remote or something. And then the next part is done quite accurately, except for one little detail, which is Watts doesn't open the door, look inside the car, and then close the door behind him. And, the actor obviously imagined, obviously he did, but he didn't. Watts left the door open behind him and then went inside the house, leaving the door open. And Nicole Atkinson, instead of following him into the house, went to the open car door and looked in there. And that gave Watts kind of 10 or 20 seconds head start. You can imagine if Nicole had followed Watts into the house, but after looking in the car, whatever Watts needed to do, he would have had 10 or 20 seconds to do it. And so you would have assumed that he had that time. One kind of has the idea that Watts himself kind of assumed that they would follow him into the house. But you can see kind of by the way that he runs up to the officer and then bypasses him and then runs into the garage, that he intends to do something. I mean, he knows Shanann's not there, and when he enters the house, he's not even acting like she's there. He doesn't ever call her name. And that's quite a strange thing about this moment. No one calls her name. No one enters the house and calls her name. Everyone enters the house and they sort of look around. You know, it's supposed to be Shanann and the kids in the house, right? Where else are they going to be? And yet nobody calls their name. But most importantly, Chris doesn't call their name. And why doesn't he call their name? Because he knows where they are. And Chris is more Chris isn't looking for them or even really pretending to look for them. Well, maybe he's pretending to look for them, but while he's pretending to look for them, he's also got stuff to do. He needs to, move certain things to certain places and all that kind of thing. Number 23, inside the house, Watts walks to the kitchen and stays there. So again, in the dramatization, this part seems to have escaped the filmmaker's attention. I must say their ability to show the same clothing is really phenomenal. They're really good at sourcing the same clothes. They're very good at surfaces, but they're very bad at just thinking about what's going on. Very, very bad. And so in the dramatization, they kind of show Chris Watts walk to the kitchen, and then I think he sort of looks into the pantry, and then he kind of stands around. That's not what happened in the actual footage. I think everybody knows that as Coonrod sort of approached Watts was always like 5 or 10 steps ahead of everybody else. You know, he was never like standing around, let's talk about this. He was sort of running ahead of everyone like, I'm looking, I need to be somewhere else. And so in the actual footage, we know that as Coonrod sort of almost entered the kitchen, Watts sort of scooted around him and made for the basement. Watts obviously knows his home better than anyone. And so he finds kind of another way around Coonrod. And Coonrod's sort of walking quite quickly behind Watts, saying, trying to asking him questions. And Watts is sort of calling over his shoulder, saying, yeah, that's fine, and whatever it is. So Coonrod doesn't really see Watts sort of go down the basement and let the dog out. He's not necessarily that aware of it, but that is exactly what's going on. But now, why is Dieter in the basement? I mean, no one thinks to ask about that. Nicole Atkinson doesn't seem to sort of notice. We don't know whether she saw this, but just this alone ought to have put suspicion on Watts early on. And in retrospect, it shows premeditation and post-meditation. So what I mean is, in the dramatization of Shanann arriving home, which happens at the end of the film, where's Dieter? Shouldn't Dieter be at the front door? Shouldn't Dieter be happy to see someone arriving home? Shouldn't Dieter be running up the steps with her? Where's Dieter? I can tell you where he is. He's more than likely in the basement. And he's in the basement because he needs to be out of the way. And why does he need to be out of the way? Well, if you're going to attack somebody, you don't want the dog to interfere with that and possibly bite you or cause a problem while this is happening. And some dogs do that. And you might scoff and say, you're overthinking this, or that the dog isn't a detail worth thinking about. But if you look at the Henry van Breda axe murder case, in that case, a young man, I think he was about 22 years old, axed to death his entire family. But before he did that, he took his dog that normally slept in his room, and he put the dog in the garage. And there was blood everywhere, and there were no doggy prints in blood. Why? Because the dog wasn't the dog wasn't given free run of the house during the commission of the crime, when he normally would have free run of the house, and a murder was committed in the same room where the dog normally slept. And so that shows you premeditation just in the sequestration of the dog. Well, we're at 34 minutes. Let's move on. Point number 24, Chris Watts is depicted as awkward as he views the Trinastich surveillance video. Now, for me, this was a very jarring moment between how the actor portraying Chris Watts had been until this moment and this moment. So in other words, the Chris Watts that seemed quite balanced, quite normal, just a normal kind of confident guy, and suddenly in this moment is suddenly very weird. And that was very, very jarring. You don't see any of that weirdness sort of otherwise. Or I didn't sort of pick it up. I didn't think, wow, what seems weird here and weird there. And to be honest, before the movie came out, I thought this was going to be about how dark and monstrous and evil it's going to try and portray Chris Watts in that way. So I was kind of surprised when they did portray him. I think what they were going for was Chris Watts the narcissist, Chris Watts the selfish guy, Chris Watts the sort of shallow guy. And in a way, that's better than trying to portray him around every corner as being dark and brooding and, with evil intentions, because I don't think that was him either. But I don't think the narcissism thing works either, because how does that make Chris Watts different to anybody else? How does Chris Watts being selfish and shallow make him different to anybody else? So again, if I'd been making this film, I would have portrayed him as an introvert, which is basically, and I realize it's an oversimplification, but basically just a very quiet person. So a person who doesn't volunteer a lot, a person who allows others to be in control, a person who's thinking a lot of the time and not very communicative, right? And that's it. Just kind of a quiet, reserved sort of personality. A person that's holding a lot in, that's all. And that's not the impression I got at all of the actor. Instead I kind of got the idea that the Chris Watts was quite a assertive, I wouldn't say an extrovert, but definitely not an introvert, just a normal kind of balanced guy, selfish balanced guy. So if you're interested, go and look at my video on the psychology of the introvert, see what you think about it. I know a lot of people don't like it. It's not sexy enough. They want a nice sort of salacious kind of term, nice meaty diagnosis, something disorder, and even the word narcissist has got a nice essy, sort of sexy sound to it, whereas introvert is just such a weak kind of assessment of a person. And of course, if you might say, well, how does that play into anything? Well, if you have a situation where someone is introverted and someone else is somewhat controlling, that can cause a shift in the power dynamics beyond a critical minimum. And you can ask yourself, do you think that happened in this case? Do you think the control in terms of the marriage got more and more and more in terms of one particular person, and less and less and less in terms of the other person? And no one is saying whose fault that is, just did that happen? Did this sort of line of control, this locus of control, shift over time? Did the one personality become a lot more extroverted because of social media? Did the other personality become more introverted because of that same social media? Right? Just certain things to think about. And if you do think about it, you could take that further. I'm not going to take it very far here, but you could ask yourself, would an introvert want to confront someone on something like, I'm having an affair, I want a divorce? Would they sort of be falling over themselves to communicate something like that? Would an introvert want to go to court and be asked questions and be on trial? Would an introvert like the idea of sitting in court with everybody sort of looking at him, cameras on him, a whole crowd of people around him, would he like that? Would he like that situation? Would an introvert in that situation want to sort of stand up in court and sort of say anything on his own behalf? Would an introvert want to kind of, make a big thing about defending himself? And then take the same question and say, would a narcissist mind going to court where everyone is there to sort of talk about him and what he did and what he's thinking? Would a narcissist in a situation in court want to speak up about what they thought or said or did? And would a narcissist want to try and manipulate everybody? Would a narcissist in a situation where someone's thinking that they having an affair or whatever, try and confront the person and try and manipulate them into thinking, well, I think you're imagining things, I'm not having an affair? Would a narcissist be honest about it? Would a narcissist say, okay, I'm putting up my hand, I'm having an affair? So all those people who think that Chris Watts is a narcissist, why wouldn't you use all your tricks of the trade and go to court and do your thing manipulating people? Because in the history of high-profile cases, just all the cases we've looked at over time, from Casey Anthony to O.J. Simpson to Oscar Pistorius to Jodi Arias to all of these people, how many of them just sort of after a week said, I'm going to take a plea deal and I'm going to just throw in the towel on my narcissism. I'm just going to give up. I love myself so much, but I'm just going to give up on myself and go to jail and admit to my crimes. Because that's what narcissists do, right? They admit to their crimes. They take accountability, right? So I've just got to say I'm really sick of hearing that assessment of Chris Watts. And, it seems like if you have an expert saying it, then that's the truth. Anyway, so number 25, we back to the interrogation cubicle, but Watts is sitting in the wrong place, right? And so you don't have any of that scenario that we saw in the actual interrogation. And this is also part that I just do not understand. I don't understand how filmmakers have got such a simple situation to deal with. It's a square room with a clock in it and a desk and a few chairs. It's basically got nothing inside of it. And yet you can't get a simple thing right like seating arrangements. So where was Chris Watts sitting? He was sitting kind of at the head of the desk with his back to the camera. His father came in and put his hand on his son's shoulder and then sat in a chair on the left. How hard is it to get that right? And you might say, well, they want a bit of license because they want to show his face. Well, then get into the cubicle and film it inside the cubicle at the sort of reverse angle from the angle of the clock. And when you see a mistake like that, which is just so simple, it's a square room. You can't even position the individuals in it. It's just scary. It just makes you wonder, where do these filmmakers not have attention to detail, just like basic attention to detail? I do think the fact that they don't depict Chris Watts actually talking to his father and confessing, like one-on-one. There is a scene of Ronnie Watts sort of at the end of the hallway. I think that was because the case hasn't gone to trial. There's still the possibility that part could be disputed, and so if Lifetime had any legal people giving them advice, which I believe they absolutely do. Bear in mind, Lifetime is part of the world's biggest company, Disney, so they would definitely be getting legal advice. And so they probably said, look, we're just not going to go there. We're not going to talk about that particular thing. And what's interesting about that scene where Chris Watts actually confesses for the very first time, what he's confessing to basically is just the fact that the children have died. But it's not true that Shanann killed him, but he kind of confesses in inverted commas to that as well. And although that's not true, it's still part of the discovery, and it's still part of kind of what we know. And so to depict that is legally shaky territory for the reason that you can't quite hear in the recording exactly what Chris Watts is saying. And so just like that surveillance footage of Trisnastich, it's not 100% clear. You're not going to be able to use it in court. And so if Chris Watts did go to trial and they put this recording in court, it wouldn't really be sufficient, because you can't quite hear exactly what he's saying. I mean, you can get the gist of what he's saying, and it does sound like he's saying what he's saying, but the confession in inverted commas to Ronnie Watts is whispered and it's indistinct. And so even that wouldn't be something that they could absolutely prove. And so legally it's kind of shaky ground. Number 26, and the scene of Watts confessing to his father that I've sort of already spoken about. You can go to the actual blog post to watch what I call the number one what the F moment in the Chris Watts case. You can go and check that out. I do think it's incredible that this, one of the biggest moments in the whole case, isn't even shown in the Lifetime movie. Number 27, who said, I think we're very, very close, but we're not quite there yet. Well, in the Lifetime movie, it was Tammy Lee, but in reality, it was Agent Coda. And I also have made a movie about that. You can go and look at it. But the reason I put it up is one of the questions I asked people before the movie came out was, I said, do you think that the agents believe Chris Watts? Like when he says something and they answer and they say, oh, really, or whatever, does it sound like they actually believe what he's saying? Because you don't really get the version, especially from Coda, where at the end he says, well, I don't really believe that and that and that and that. It's just not given. And all we're left with is Watts' version and their responses. But they're letting Watts sort of dig his own grave. That they're giving Watts enough rope to hang himself, and he did. But you've got to go to that moment where he says, I think we're very, very close, and look at what Agent Coda says just before he says that, the version that is going on just before he says that. And he's not talking about a murder at the well site. This is the first confession. This is where he's saying, I think you did this. I think you did all of it. I think you did it in the house. And I think you did it because you wanted this other life. I think there's another Chris Watts. I think there are two faces to Chris Watts. Or what? What else could it be? Now, it was actually Nathan Trisnastich who said, he's not acting right, and others as well just said Chris Watts was talking far too much. He wasn't his normal self, with the police. Why? Because he was acting like a normal guy. He was acting the way that they thought a normal guy would act, which is just to talk normally. So he was trying to act not himself. In other words, not an introvert, not a quiet person that you would suspect, but just a normal, nice guy. And that is part of the sort of Silver Fox caricatures, is him acting the way that you think he should act, which is just normal talking. And you don't really get to see the reserved Chris Watts, the guy who doesn't really say anything, except in certain moments. There's a moment where Shanann records him test driving a Tesla, and Chris Watts just basically doesn't say anything the entire drive. He tries to make conversation, but he really doesn't really have anything to say. He just is that kind of person, is in his own headspace. And so points 28 to 31, I'm not dealing with on this channel. If you're interested in it, you can head on to the Patreon channel under the $5 tier. That's where I sort of examine it. A couple of things that I look at are, what is Shanann wearing when she gets into bed? Is she carrying the suitcase into the bedroom? Does she change? Does she brush her teeth? All those kind of things. So some of you may be aware that I've written 10 books on the Chris Watts case. I received a question recently just with someone saying they want to read the books, but they've got no idea in which order to read them. So this list should give you some clarity on that. The first book, The Man Underneath Christopher Watts, was published on September 10th, 2018. And then Beneath the Oil, Two Pollyannas, Rape of Cassandra. And then Drilling Through Discovery was published after the Discovery came out. So you basically had 3 books that came out pre-Discovery, just based on what we knew, but also based on insight from looking at the evidence, looking at certain testimony, looking at the plans of the house and certain other aspects. There was a little bit of discovery that was included in Rape of Cassandra, but book number 5 is very heavy on the discovery. Book 6 is one of the longest books, I think, if not the longest books in the series. Quite a difficult book to write. And then Annihilation was originally meant to be the last book. But then you kind of had Chris Watts going, giving that second confession. And then that led to the book Oblivion. And I wrote Oblivion when I came back from Europe. I went to Europe for a while and I came back and wrote it. To be honest, I'm not 100% sure if it was if it was Annihilation or Oblivion that I wrote after Europe, but I do think books 7 and 8 are probably the best in the series. And then 9, Epilogue, was basically the end of basically a wrap of the Two-Face series. And then because of the third confessions from Letters to Christopher, I thought I would just attend to that. And so I've already written 1 book in a new series called The Silver Fox, or Silver Fox, and the first book in that series is already out. A lot of people have spoken positively about that. The next book in the Silver Fox series should be coming out sometime in February. I can't say exactly when. And then, also on this channel, I want to touch on 13 things Lifetime got right and what that means. So if you're interested in that kind of analysis, please subscribe to the channel. Very important to like, share, leave a comment, but especially share through social media. That'll help other people to also subscribe to the channel, come to the channel, get to know the channel. And then in terms of Patreon, some coverage that I'm going to be putting up. And this is an open question to you guys. Do you know when the little video, My Daddy is a Hero, was made? Do you have any idea when that video was made? If you do know, leave it in a comment, or if you don't know. But that's a question that I'm going to talk about, and talk about what lies behind that question. That'll be on Patreon. I also have a ongoing series on Patreon dealing with the Atkinson transcripts. If you don't want to go to Patreon, go to Crime Rocket and just search Atkinson transcripts in the search bar. There are 15 pages dealing with that. Really, really interesting. But also the series on Patreon, I think, is also very... there's a lot of insight, a lot of interesting things that we get directly from Nicole Atkinson. And, of course, this part of the discovery wasn't sort of part of the original file, just sort of separate. And then there's also an audio version of the third confession on Patreon. I think at this point We're up to chapter 5 or 6. I sort of put up a chapter every second or third day. I certainly won't be putting one up today, just because my voice is really not in a good place today. Again, apologies about that. And then I'm also doing a series debunking the killing of John Bonet podcast on Patreon. I think that's under the $2 tier. The audiobooks under the $5 tier, and the Atkinson transcripts under the $1 tier. So head on over to Patreon/TCRS for that. And thank you for listening, and I'll speak to you guys